Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Steer Your Career podcast. On today's podcast, I have one of my former 38 bosses, Jason Rudman, on the podcast. Jason was a very influential leader for me back at my time at American Express, and now he's a chief member and digital experience officer of BE. Jason and I talk a lot about our time at American Express, about how he managed through his imposter syndrome, also how he kept his personal life separate from his work life during his time at American Express, and also how he really inspired me as a leader. We also dive deep into calibration, which is performance management, and how companies decide what rating you get and how much compensation you get. So we dig into some inside aspects of that. So I think you'll learn a lot from that. Before we dig into that episode, just as a reminder, if you are an ambitious professional and you are looking to own your career, we help you get better jobs quickly, confidently, and with lots more money here at Kadima Careers. So if you want to learn about any of our coaching programs, either our personalized coaching program, our group coaching program, or our digital courses, just go to kadimacareers.com and check them out. Or always feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn. I look at all my DMs and I respond to each and every one of them. So with that, enjoy this episode of the Steer Your Career with me and Jason Rudman. Last three words I'll leave you with before we head into that episode are own your career. Hello, and welcome back to another Steer Your Career podcast where we talk with some great leaders out there and where they share great advice with ambitious professionals that are ready to begin owning their career. On today's episode, I'm very fortunate and privileged to have one of my former bosses on here. And Jason was my boss. I actually have a spreadsheet on here. He was my boss in 2006 when I was at American Express. And he saved me from a very terrible boss that I was working for in one area of the business. And he brought me over to work on one of my favorite products ever, the American Express Costco card. And then Jason was my leader there for a couple of years. I learned a lot from Jason, and I still take a lot of my learnings from Jason to this day. So with that, I'd love to introduce you to Jason Rudman. And Jason, if you can tell folks a little bit about you and what you've done since our days at American Express.
Wow. So, hey, thanks for the invite. Thanks for the kind words. Right back at you. You were one of the best hires that I've had in my entire career, and we can get into that if you want to in terms of why and how I still feel that way. Since American Express, well, what a journey and a good one. So I think it's worth saying that I spent 13 years at American Express. You and I connected in the first half of my career, and within American Express in 13 and a half years, I had 8 different roles, which I think set me up for the success in quotes that I feel that I have today. From there, I moved the family to a regional bank, Key Bank in Cleveland, to take on a role running initially consumer payments. And then 9 months later, I was promoted and given the digital banking expression for the entire consumer bank to effectively transform and reimagine how a regional bank went to market from a digital perspective. I was unceremoniously let go. We'll talk about that as well. I speak truth, right? 5 years, did amazing things. And then the call came on December the 14th. Never, ever let somebody go between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Just not the way to do it. But we're going to take your great job. We're going to split it into 3. And there's a place for you, but there's not really a place for you. And I thank them dearly for that decision every day. And I love Key Bank, but it was the right call for my career. I then moved the family again just before COVID to San Antonio, Texas to go work for USAA running deposits and payments as the GM. A great experience, a tough experience. And then I had enough of the GM route, and we can get into that in terms of what I learned. And so I then went to a SPAC startup, Finance of America, where I was their first chief customer officer for about 15 months, and then decided that was not my journey. And then I took a sabbatical for the first time in my life. And I waited for the universe to tell me I knew what I wanted to do. And I waited for the universe to give me an opportunity that married what I wanted to do at this moment in my life. And I now am the Chief Member and Digital Experience Officer for BECU, or Boeing Employees Credit Union, as it used to be known. And I lead 1,370 people in the great state of Washington, although I'm based in LA. And I have responsibility for marketing, brand, digital, physical. We have 62 what we call neighborhood financial centers where you can go and get all of your financial services needs met. Voice, which the voice expression through the contact center and other modalities, as well as communications and PR.
And it's great that you are so in depth with the detail that you're leading 1,370 people. And I know before you and I got on the air today, you were mentioning that after this call, you're conducting an interview. But I'm curious, what do you look for in a candidate? And maybe if you want to give a little color of who you're looking at for this role or just in general, you've hired lots of people over the course of your career. You hired me, and I know you did some pretty deep due diligence on me and some back channeling on me, which I give you kudos for that. Most people don't do that. But as you're going into this interview later today, how do you approach that as the hiring manager? Or I don't know if you're the hiring manager, but you are either the decision maker or consultant in this space.
I am the decision maker. It's for a role reporting to me, which will be leading marketing. It's one of my 5 direct reports. So I think it's a combination of aptitude and attitude, and this is a pretty senior role, right? It's an SVP role. It will be one of the 30 to 40 leaders in the entire company. We're on a mission to transform the way we do marketing. We're good. I want us to be great. And so what do I look for? Well, this is round 1. And one of my first questions is, what are your impressions of the BECU brand? And what I'm looking for is honesty. We're not perfect. And so if you come in and tell me, oh, it's great, then I'm like, well, you haven't done your homework, because it's not. If you're going to take this role, you've got to be able to offer critique. And I always say, big difference between criticism and critique. Even when I present what I'm presenting, I say to my team all the time, I'm not going to criticize you or the work, but we should be able to offer critique of what we're doing. And there's a huge difference. In this role, I'm also looking for somebody that's able to demonstrate their ability to think and act strategically. And again, not you were somebody handed you the strategy and you implemented the strategy, but how did you take something that was amorphous or disconnected on paper and you led people through a level of strategic thinking, critical thinking and analytical rigor. Alan, right, you said that I did my homework. It's worth, I think, the audience appreciating. I did my homework because I thought that you had amazing raw talent, and a couple of people said, no, there was something about you and the way that you thought that was actually a compliment to how I thought. And I think great leaders sometimes hire for what they are not as great doing. And so I also look in this interview period that I'm going through with this role for people that actually can teach me some things. Yeah, I've been in financial services for over 20 years. I don't know everything. I don't claim to know everything. And the world is moving at such a fast pace that I think even a leader at my level, and I'm not a leveler either, I have chief in front of my name only so that I can actually go and knock down some doors that you might not be able to get work done. I don't stand on titles and ceremony. Easy for me to say, I guess, because I've got chief in front of my name. But I look for people that can complement me and actually bring skills that I may not have or I haven't actually used in a great while. So that critical thinking, analytical rigor, how do you solve problems? Demonstrate for me the now what, and how you actually work through a problem. And you've got to have a real crisp situation, complication, resolution example for me so that you can demonstrate your thinking. And then the final point is, how do you lead? This is a significant leadership position. So who are you as a leader? And beyond I'm this, I show up like that, I do this, I'm diverse, I'm inclusive. Yes. How have you dealt with challenging, dynamic workforce issues, particularly in a post-pandemic environment where I think our whole world and our whole way of thinking and relating to each other has been completely scrambled? So round 1, strategy, critical thinking and analytical rigor. And then how do you lead in what is increasingly, as I tell my team, a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, chaotic, and ambiguous.
And it's only getting more volatile, more uncertain, more, I don't know if you get more ambiguous, but yeah, and complex. It's interesting that you talk about how you hired for complementary skills. And I remember back to that team, which was now 18 years ago. We're pretty old. You created like a great team there. I don't know how you acquired everybody on that team, but Hetty was great. Laura Penny, like you helped to grow her from, I think she might have been a contractor
She was.
to like full-time employee. And then Elena was amazing, and she's moved on to great things, working at LinkedIn, and I think doing some work with you now. So that was one of the funnest teams that I worked on during my time at. I want to thank you for bringing that team together and dealing with all our quirks, because all of us had our strengths and like the watch outs. But I think you created a good cohesive team there. So thank you.
Thanks to the team. Look, at the end of the day, we're all in it together, right? I think part of what I've learned is, and again, I appreciate the sentiments that you said about growing people, because that's ultimately my job. At the end of the day, right, when you pull a team together and you've been given the opportunity to lead, just lead, right? You and I could probably name a few people, but we won't, right? That we've had as leaders or seen as leaders. And that's not the experience that we want to replicate. So I'm also a great studier of behavior and people. And I've picked up some things and I've watched some things and I've seen some things. And it's a simple truth, which is do the things that made you feel great for other people, and don't replicate the things that left a sour taste in your mouth or were experienced on you, right? Not all the leaders that have led me have been great. I don't judge them for that. That's their work that they have to do. But my job is not to replicate that and put that on somebody else. And I think I was lucky as well with the team that we had. And it's a we team, not an I team. I didn't create it, right? It's pieces and parts. You want to complement even the team so that the team ultimately, if they're game, can learn from each other as well. And we grew some great careers there. Laura's gone on to great things. You've gone on to great things. Hetty, Elena, each one of you, like I keep tabs. I'm still connected to many of the people that I've led. It gets harder as your teams get bigger, but everybody has gone on and done great things. And I think that's a mark of who they were within the context of the team that we built.
Yeah. So I knew you were a strong leader then, and I do judge my leaders. I know you don't. I actually have a scorecard with all 29 jobs that I've worked at and all 38 bosses that I've had. And my jobs on average have an average GPA of 3.5 on a 4-point scale.
Okay.
My bosses on average have a 2.6, so barely passing. You were a B plus, and which is good because I'm a very high grader bosses. And I've also had a lot of bosses, so it's a tough curve. I don't even know why I scored you that, but I learned something from even the shitty bosses that I had. And like of those 38 bosses, 9 of them are what I judge to be assholes. You are far away from that. Yeah, I wouldn't be having this conversation with you. Although
it might be cathartic. We'll be like, hey, I want to reveal some things. How are you different? Where are they now? It could be a where are they now session.
Yeah, and actually that would be interesting. But my point was that I think like you've had good bosses, you've had shitty bosses. I don't know if you you don't rank them like I do, but you learn from all of those situations. And even the ones that you have that were not great, there's probably things that you might have learned of like, when I'm leading people, I'm not doing that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Look, one of the best lessons that I learned early was that you have to be very deliberate and clear with your feedback, whether it's great feedback, which I don't think we do enough of. We assume that people, I'm going up things that you're fine. And then I've been on the receiving end of no feedback. And then all of a sudden somebody drops the anvil and says, but you didn't do these 2 things right. And I'm like, well, but what about the 100 other things that were going well? How do I balance that? And then I think when you give constructive feedback and you offer critique, I always stay away from criticism, right? And my mom told me very early on in life, talk about the situation, not the person. Right? Because we've all got things going on in our lives and our daily life. I'm not here to criticize you as a person, but situationally, if there's opportunity, we should have a conversation about it. And that's why when you look up the definition of criticism and critique in Webster's, they're different for a reason, right? When you offer critique, I think you also as a leader have to offer solutions and be able to talk through, here's how I might approach that, or what can I do to help you land the plane the next time? And some of my experiences on the receiving end of that, where I was essentially left to fend from, here's the feedback and go figure it out. Or here's the feedback. And I'm like, but what's the work that I have to do? Oh, well, it's actually just subjective feedback. Well, then subjective feedback's really tough because I don't know how to fix it. right? I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to move forward with it. I think the other thing that I've learned as well, and I think in this increasingly diverse and inclusive world, is that leaders sometimes are microaggressive without even knowing that they're microaggressive situationally, particularly, and I want to be clear here around diversity of thinking, diversity of lived experience, as well as diversity of how you show up and how you're represented, whether race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. And I think that in this world that we're in, leaders actually have to think beyond their borders. And it's really important that I think as a leader, you have a much broader lived in experience than maybe you had in seasons past because of the workforce that we're dealing with, right? My voice channel has 4 generations of people that have either a baby boomer experience to a zillennial experience, right? A Gen Z experience. We're probably going to have some Gen Alphas coming really soon. So we'll add five generations think, act, work very differently. That requires you as a leader to have an appreciation for the modalities of learning, the way folks think, their expectations in the workforce. And if you don't have that lived experience, you owe it to yourself and your team to go find it.
Yeah, totally agreed on that. So one topic I'd like to go into is I had a perception of you as a very strong leader, very kind leader. I remember you giving me good feedback, like critique in one-on-one meetings about how some of the things that I would say might be off-putting in meetings. And you'd give me specifics and you'd give me some tips on how to address that. So I always appreciated that about you, but there were some things that I was not aware of you during the time when you led me. 2 things. One, you talk a lot about imposter syndrome and how you've dealt with that. So I always have seen you and experienced you as a confident person who knows what the hell he's doing. So if you felt that on the inside, that never came across on the outside. And the other thing that I was not aware of, and I forget when I was made aware of this, is when you first started leading us, you were not openly out as a gay man, or at least not that I was aware of. I remember like there were sometimes being rumors and sometimes people asking me, is Jason gay? I don't think so. I don't know. But I didn't really think much of it. But you had those 2 alter characteristics of you felt like an imposter and you were gay, but not at work. At least I don't think in 2006, or at least I wasn't aware of it. So is there any commonality there?
Absolutely connected, right? Brene Brown says, right, and I'm paraphrasing here, if you can find negative perceptions of yourself if you go look for them, and I'm paraphrasing, right? And so for me, the 2 examples, they were absolutely connected. So look, my husband and I have been together for 26 years. So in 2006, I was 8 years into a relationship that very few people knew about at work. I grew up in England in an environment, so my teenage years were at the height of the AIDS crisis in a country, much like the United States, where gay people were shunned, homophobia was rife, and we were told as a community that we were going to hell and not going to amount to anything, right? So you have to unlearn all of that, Alan, right? Like my mom and dad, great. Accepting, didn't really understand it, accepting. And I left home when I was 18 and I went to university and I moved to New York when I was 23 and did a master's degree. And I'm privileged and blessed beyond measure. And yet, for underrepresented communities, whether that be women, people of color, BTQ people, so much of what we have to do is unlearning what we've been told about what our place is, what we can aspire to, what we can achieve. And even in American Express, which by any standard is the most open. I have friends today that were out at work. I couldn't do that. I just didn't know how to do that for myself. And that's what feeds the imposter syndrome. I mean, you're complimentary of my leadership experience, but you weren't getting the best of me in that environment. I know you weren't. Who I am.
That's why you only got a B+.
That's why I only got a B+. I had to tell myself that it was okay. It was okay to be authentically who I was in the workplace and that I wasn't going to be judged for it. Now, I will say, early in my career at American Express, and I am confident about this, I was being led by somebody who was uncomfortable, who actually did know that I was gay and was incredibly uncomfortable with it. And it was obvious. We're not here to name and shame. That's not what we do. And I believe that my career was held back because of it momentarily, right? I'm a fighter. I am a fighter internally. Before I became your boss, the role before that as a director, I applied to be a director at American Express 13 times and got turned down. 13. The role that I got, that you were part of my team, I was the runner-up. I was told no, and the only reason I got the job, Alan, is because the person they were going to hire externally wanted too much money. And they came back and they told me, well, I was like, well, why? You told me you were going to hire somebody externally. Yeah, they wanted too much money, so here we are. Do you want the job? And I was like, oh, yeah, I'll take the job. I mean, I've been at American Express for 5 years. I think I'm good. But sure, I'll take the job. And then, look, 18 months later, I'm sitting on a beach with Al Kelly and Susan Stopp as one of the 157 leadership award winners for excellent performance. So it's just spaces and places. And I think it was at that point, Alan, that I knew that I didn't need to be an imposter anymore, because I think through that curve, when people would say, are you dating? I would say, hey, yeah, I've been in a relationship for 6 years. And people were like, what? How? Wow. Oh, 8 years at that point. And look, here we are today. My husband and I, 26 years together, and we have 2 kids, and we've been on television in Key and celebrating Key Bank, and it's a full arc. But imposter syndrome is also really sneaky, because when I was displaced at Key Bank, after taking them on a journey of transforming consumer payments and digital, and I do want to say, I love Key Bank. I love the folks at Key Bank. It was a brilliant decision. In the moment, you're a little panged and you're a little pained, but the universe knew what they were doing with that decision. But when that happens, I was not good enough. What could I have done differently? Hold on a minute, I thought I was doing A, B, and C, and you were telling me I was doing A, B, and C, and now you've moved the goalposts. And I was an EVP, I was leading consumer payments and digital for the entire consumer bank. So both horizontally and then a GM of a P&L. And on December the 14th, my boss pulled me into his office and turned around and said, we're going in a different direction. We're taking your role. We're splitting it into 3. And there's something you could do. And I finished the sentence and said, you don't want me to do it, you, the organization, and I'm not going to do it anyway. But after that, when you start we had 2 kids at that point. Yeah, imposter syndrome crept in again a little. It was like, am I not good enough? Hold on a minute. How did that happen? And I had to go back and rewind and say, oh, could I have done it? Yeah, I could have. I wouldn't have authentically been me. Like, I could have made some different decisions and gone some different routes, but I stand here today doing the best job that I've ever done. I'm like a kid in a candy store now at BECU, knowing that if I'd taken those routes, I might still have been at Key in Cleveland, and that would have been okay, but it wouldn't have been anywhere near as great as the role that I'm doing right now, and the impact that I'm able to have, and the team that I've got with me side by side, trying to improve the financial well-being of 1.5 million people on a daily basis.
Wow. So one other memorable story for me from the time that we worked together was it was when I first learned about calibration, performance management and calibration. And American Express had a calibration program on G&L, goals and leadership. And you get scored 1, 2, or 3 on goals based on your quantifiable performance for roles that you can. And you'd get a 1, 2, or 3 on leadership on are you exhibiting blue box values like influencing without authority and communicating effectively, whatever. We had some values there.
Alan, there were 8 of them. You got scored on 8 of them.
When I worked with you, AmEx was good with performance management because they would have the employee write their review first, share it with the boss, and then the boss would look at it and say, okay, we're aligned. This is cool. It's not going to be a tough conversation. Probably like 10% of the time, maybe 20% of the time with an employee, you're like just wildly off. And I put in my score that year for a 1, I think like a 1 on goal, because you and I were fortunate enough to work on the Costco card when gas prices were spiking and they put 5% off on gas. We just had so much wind at our back. We just had to put the cards in the Costco stores and customers were signing up for them. So you and I just nailed our goals. Way off the chart. So I put in for a 1, 2. You gave a lot of good insight, like without revealing too much, but you're like, hey, if we give you a 1 on goals, we're going to have to lower the L. And I was like, they shouldn't be correlated. That's how I heard it. Because like AmEx was really trying to fight for a distribution of talent of combined 2s, like a 1 and 1, to like combined 6, 3 plus 3. Yeah. So you have like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And a couple of people fall in the 2s, 1 goal, 1 L, and a couple of people fall in the 6s, 3, 3. And the 3 3s usually get fired. And the 1 1s usually get promoted or go to the beach with Al Kelly and Susan Sobbit.
You're talking that was me that year? Is that what you're saying?
I'm guessing. I never got a 1 1. I was never on the beach with Al and Susan.
I only made it once, mate. I only made it once.
Yeah, but that was a very rude awakening to me. And you as a leader, like you can reveal everything that went on in the room. And I was never in the calibration room at that point. Like I was an individual contributor at that time. But this was a very meaningful story for me in my career. And I didn't fault you for it. I actually faulted your boss at the time for not pushing more for me. But anyway, we don't need to go who we're faulting. But it was like the first time that I understood that it's not really a true meritocracy. Or maybe not the first time I realized it. But love to hear your perspective of that situation, if it was meaningful to you at all, or memorable to you at all. And also give a little inside information about the challenges that you as a leader have with calibrating a portfolio of talent.
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Let's first honor American Express. You and I are still connected. We were part of what I call the golden era of American Express, and I'm not knocking American Express now. I haven't worked there since 2013, but those relationships and that experience continue to pay dividends today, right? So as we offer critique to anything at American Express, I think it's really important that everybody...
Oh, I'm not critiquing AmEx, because that's calibration like I've seen in every other place.
Yeah.
That was the first time I was ever exposed to
it. Again, I think the context is important. Your point is it's a much broader question about calibration, right? But there's something unique about American Express in my experience because they managed to a bell curve, right? They actually managed to a very deliberate bell curve. So there were only ever so many 1-1s to your point. I think the 3-3s, Alan, that you and I were there when there were 4s and 5s. I was there when a 3-3 was 70% of the population would get a 3-3, right? Which was, you did what needed to be done. Thank you. I think the challenge with that calibration, and it's really interesting, I've learned 3 things. The first is the goals never changed. There was no recalibration in the year if there was a macro environment or something changed or we decided to go on a different strategy. It never happened. Never once did my goals change, even if the environment did. So in the current, we don't calibrate through a bell curve. BECU, we don't. But what I committed to the team, because I joined the team in November, is if there's material change to the macro environment or strategy, then we're going to update your goal so that if something that is like way above target should be a stretch, should be rare, but there needs to be a path to achieving it. You mentioned in the particular instance, wind at your back. So it was wind at our back. But Alan, we didn't just sit there and just wait for the wind to catch us. That's why you and I were talked about in a different way, is because we just didn't sit there and do work. We actually took the wind and then we just accelerated the boat tremendously. So I just want to acknowledge that. One is, in a number of calibration experiences I've been in, the goals never changed. And then you get to the end of the year and you're like, well, you didn't make the goal. But the environment changed. Well, yeah, but you didn't make the goal. Number 2 is, I think, the curve or the pool of payout very often doesn't keep up with the attainment of the team because everybody's managing to a budget. So you're managing to a budget. Then you get wonky outcomes because you have to manage to a budget. And when we say you manage to a budget as a leader, they don't give you an extra dollar. Like that dollar is the dollar, right? There may be a little bit of gravy that comes at the end, but the rating doesn't change. What happens is the dollar amount changes within the range. So that's number 2, is the pool generally doesn't change. So you're operating not only within a calibrated curve at American Express, but the pool doesn't really move that much. And then number 3 is, and it happened a few times. It didn't happen the year. I remember the years because they seared in my brain. The calibration experiences, they were brutal. It was essentially the Hunger Games sometimes, right? Now, is that what AmEx expected? No. Is that how sometimes they were led? Yeah. And you could see it sometimes. More often than not, no, Alan. I just want to be really clear. Not in your year, but in a couple of years within Open, that's where we were, and in a couple of other parts of the organization, depending on who was leading it, it was brutal, right? There was clear favoritism. And then as a leader, I think you had to say your piece contextually, and then you had to let it go. Because if you kept going, you unfortunately were putting your own brand at risk. And I sit with that. That's an unfortunate statement for me to say. And again, I want to be really clear. AmEx, pound for pound, great environment, as you and I said. Episodically, a couple of times, It was the Hunger Games. And I think as a leader, I mean, I brought calibration to key very deliberately with my team. We'd sit in a meeting and we'd talk about 60 people for a whole day. And so you learn that experience and you don't replicate that experience. And there's always going to be a subjective element to it, but you also have to look very clearly at the objective outcomes and then how people achieve those outcomes. Did they do them in a way where they were inviting, they were collaborating, they were building relationships, or was it all a scorched earth policy, which is look, you got the ship to the port, but it has no sails. You lost all your cargo and you're the only person left on the ship. So that's where the debate often relied. So those would be the three things, right? There's only so many grades that were given out at so many levels, managing to a curve. The pool is the pool, so you're also having to manage to money. And sometimes if you don't do it right, it becomes a little bit of the Hunger Games.
And yeah, and my point was not at all to cast aspersion on Amex, because the first time I even heard the term calibration, I think you were pretty transparent about what happened with the situation. Like not into explicit detail, but to give me some guidance. And then a year or two later, I got promoted to director. So I got invited into one of those Hunger Games. I was like, what the hell is this? But then I was like, I totally understood what happened to me back then, because I heard these conversations going on to try to manage towards a number. And by the way, like that was my first calibration I ever sat through at Amex, because you're only in calibration if you're a manager or a leader. Right. And then as calibration goes higher and higher in the ranks, people start weeding out of the meeting because they're not going to have you in the meeting to calibrate Jason versus other directors at American Express. But then I proceeded to sit in 34 other calibrations, mostly at Google, because Google used to do them quarterly, which was holy cow. Like it's Hunger Games on steroids. And we would be calibrating between a 0.0 to 4.0. So there were 41 scores. Wow. And we were debating, is Jason a 3.3 or a 3.4? And if we give him a 3.4 here, what's that going to send, the message going to send to him? And it was ridiculous. So then I sat in like multiple calibrations there. Like I led some in my career as well. I did it at Facebook. I did it at Salesforce. And regardless of what process there is, and regardless of what distribution there is, there's always a distribution and there's always politics. And it always is like a fucking nutso game of Hunger Games without the popcorn and without all the great cinematography.
Well, I think the challenge we face as organizations, Alan, as I listen to that, is on an absolute level, on an absolute scale, I can score you based on the work that I see in the work, right? But as you're in a pool of, let's just say 200 people that are at your level, it wasn't that many at Amex, but you're in a cohort of 12 people. I'm not keeping tabs on a relative scale as to what you're doing versus what somebody else is doing from an impact perspective and a delivery of the how. So I do want to give some balance to calibration, right? I mean, it is what it is. And I think as the Hunger Games element comes in because we've worked at highly competitive organizations. People have bought into the notion, not judging it. You can only get ahead by doing certain things, right? I mean, again, it's hyper competitive, right? It's like the Olympics. There's only one gold medal, there's only one silver medal, there's only one bronze medal, right? So by definition, it's set up to be competitive. And as a leader, you have to be attuned to relative performance. So again, I think now as I run calibrations broadly, I say to my leaders, from an absolute level, you're right. Now, on a relative level, you've got to get with your other peers and say, okay, pound for pound, where do you put these folks? And I think that's the inherent challenge, right? Because you've got to rank people. You do. That's what calibration does in the way that we've described it.
I totally understand it. It makes total sense. I think the disconnect is it's not effectively communicated to the employees. And then there's this false sense that you're getting paid based on a meritocracy, where it's loosely based on a meritocracy, but it depends on how long you're in the role. And even though tenure is not supposed to matter, if you just got in this role 6 months ago and you're doing a similar job to someone who's been there for a year and a half, that year and a half person is going to get the better score.
For sure. Right.
Cool. Well, this has been a really informative conversation. As you move on to your next ventures, I know in addition to leading BECU, the efforts there, in your sabbatical, before you came back off the bench, you started a new endeavor.
I did.
Would love to hear a little bit about that, what led to that decision and what you're doing with this side, I don't know if you call it a side project, side hustle, or how you would describe it.
Well, look, my main job is leading the team at BECU, and in between raising 2 kids and making sure that my marriage is sound, which it is, and trying to stay fit, the older that I get. I do find time to continue to curate a platform called More Elephant, which is at moreelephant.com. I'm not a procrastinator at heart, but on this, I procrastinated for about 5 years. So I had this idea 5 years ago. It was one of these moments, you can read about it on the More Elephant site, as like how the elephant got here. It's connected to my then 5-year-old son coming home from school and not listening. And we had this whole conversation about listening. And then one of those bright moments came and, oh my goodness, that's an idea. And then I sat on it for 5 years and was like, well, is it an idea? I'm not. Okay, maybe it is. And then you have time to think in a down period. And so it's essentially a platform, and you're going to be one of my guests soon on it, right? Yay. There are people like you who have great ideas, who are changing the world one idea at a time. The way that we deconstruct how you think about your career, for example, how we've got people, they're building solutions to help with representation in financial services. We've had a conversation with a real estate investor who works for a firm that revitalizes old black neighborhoods, connected to the revitalization of Harlem with Red Rooster, went to Overtown and has done the same thing. So I am not the right messenger for all of the things that are in my head about the things that I think are really interesting. That sometimes it's about poking the bear and having an honest conversation about them. And so the platform is really to invite people so that our tagline is listen, learn, live better. And I think we've got one mouth, two ears. We use the mouth way more than we use the ears. So if we just slow down, listen to some of the great things that people are doing that are having impact, positive impact on people's lives. And then the platform is just a way to syndicate that and hopefully inspire somebody who's sitting on their idea, or people that just want to get involved in a movement that ultimately, I think, invites more people to the party to share in what I think is a great idea or a great experience.
Awesome. And selfishly, I've been enjoying it because you're having great conversations with, I don't know what percent of your guests have been former Blue Box folks. It seems like 25%, but Rosa was on there, Melissa Romo was on there, lots of good AmEx people. So hopefully you have Elena on there at some point. But I enjoy listening to it. And I think our listeners of the Steer Your Career podcast will get a lot from that as well. As we're wrapping up here, last two questions I have for you, Jason. You shared lots of great insights here, but if you had to leave one final piece of sick career advice for our listeners, I know a lot of pressure. Don't mess this one up. What's your last words of wisdom before I go to the final question?
I'm going to give you an A, B, and a C because I think it's important. And I usually I think in three, right? In no particular order. Work hard, have fun. I think work's a thing in America. So work hard, have fun, and put in the work and make sure that you define what work-life integration is for you. I don't believe in work-life balance. I don't like that word. Like, it's work-life integration, right? It's how you want work to work in your life. That's number one. Number two, we talked about imposter syndrome here a little. Be yourself because everyone else is taken, and don't let anybody dim your light. And that connects to the third, which I think is the most important and what I've learned, which is be the writer and producer of your play, not an actor in somebody else's play.
I like that. That's very aligned with what we talk about here about owning your career. No one else is going to forge your path if you don't really direct your play.
That's right. Be the writer and producer of your play, not an actor in somebody else's.
Awesome. I know you talked about More Elephant. If people want to follow you, reach out to you, what's the best way that they can find you?
So moreelephant.com is the website. The podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Google Play, all of that. I'm active on LinkedIn, Jason Rudman. I'm old enough that I was on LinkedIn, I think, day one. And Jason at moreelephant.com. If you want to drop me a line, you can follow me on Instagram as well at Jason Rudman. That's more family oriented and sharing pictures of the crazy family that we have and all of the things that we get up to. So that's it. You'll probably be able to find me on Facebook as well, although Facebook is to connect with my parents that still live overseas.
Awesome, Jason. Well, this was a pleasure. I appreciate you waking up a little bit early for the West Coast time to join us on this podcast, and appreciate all you've done and influenced my career and taught me a lot about how to be a good leader and how to be a good person.
You did the work, my friend. You can take the horse to the water. The horse doesn't drink the water. The horse is very thirsty. So I just want to acknowledge that you are where you are because you put in the work and you listened and you reoriented based on what you felt was right for you.
Yeah, and AmEx was one of the few places I did not get fired from. So thank you for protecting me there.
Hey, it's all good, man. It's all good.
Cool. Okay, Jason. Well,
You're
thank you.
welcome. All
That was
right.
great.
Talk soon.